on. Go for it.
Great, thank you very much, and welcome everybody to the session with Curo Compensation. We're delighted that you're able to join us today. We're going to spend some time today talking about our new product, Curo Pay Equity Tracker. So we're going to give you a little bit of background as to why we decided to bring this product to market, and give you some insight into what the product's all about, what the proposition is about, and give you a demo of that product. So I'm going to first of all just introduce myself. So I'm Ruth Thomas. I'm based in London, as you can probably tell from my accent, and I'm Senior Consultant Industry Principal here at Curo and one of the founders. And Glazelle is also on with me. Glazelle's based in Southern California, so between us we'll be taking you through this session. So I thought I'd just very briefly introduce Curo, or Curo Compensation. Some of you may have attended a session looking at our enterprise product earlier this year, but I thought for those of you who are new to Curo, just give you a quick introduction to who we are. So we're a compensation management technology company, and we provide SaaS solutions that help companies to really drive business performance and employee engagement through their reward strategies. And we work with over 230 clients, many of them global clients across 140 countries, and we have about 300,000 employees across our different platforms. And there's three main products that we're currently marketing. Our sort of long-standing product, our flagship product, is our Curo Enterprise product, and that's what many of you, if you've been on before, would have seen that product demonstrated. So that's our compensation review platform, and that allows you to run allocation processes for merit, for incentive pay, for LTIPs. And our organisations are either using that annually or throughout the year to manage pay allocation. More recently, we've been focusing on like a pay equity practice and products to help tackle this kind of new challenge in reward. And that started a couple of years ago in the UK when the gender pay gap legislation was introduced at the beginning of 2017. And we had a number of our clients who had operations in the UK who said, you know, please, can you help us with this problem? We need something that's quick and easy to use that will help us to make sure that we can calculate our gender pay gap and comply with the UK legislation. And that was when we created Curo GPG, as we call it, or gender pay gap. So that's a self-service solution. We have about 170 companies here in the UK using that regularly now to do their reporting. And then more recently, we are now releasing Curo Pay Equity Tracker, and that's kind of taking what we've done in the UK to a global level, and I'll explain in the next 5 minutes about why we've decided to do that. So there was a number of clients with whom we work. This is just an example of that subset of that 230 clients that I just mentioned. So really, we're not prolific in any one sector. We cross all sectors, and really, you know, we work with many clients where compensation is complex, because that's where our solutions excel. And you know, we'll often be the point solution for compensation on the enterprise side that sits across other larger HCM or ERP platforms such as Workday or SAP. And we also partner. I think Rogerio is on the call today. He leads our alliances program, so he's been very active in developing the partners with whom we work. So we're here to talk today about our Pay Equity Tracker product. So I just kind of wanted to give a bit of introduction as to why we've decided to bring this product to market right now. So as I'm sure, you know, many of you are all aware, equal pay legislation is nothing new. In the US, you've had it for about 60 years. We're in the UK, a bit younger than you. Our equal pay legislation is 50 years old next year. But more recently, the talk has been around pay gaps, and that obviously became quite prevalent in the UK when the gender pay gap legislation was introduced. And if you look across, you know, most economies in the world, you will see that there is a gender pay gap in the US tracking currently at, you know, 20% on an aggregate basis. And organisations have started to look at this issue and start to try and understand what are the issues that are driving pay gaps. because they kind of believed that they were paying everybody equally, but then so they were a bit surprised to see that they actually had a pay gap. And currently, this is some data from an IBM survey that was conducted in March this year, earlier this year. This is something that sort of the first mover companies are really just starting to get going on. So we've got about 12% of companies in the market operating as first movers on the whole topic of gender equality and trying to tackle that as an organizational issue. And you know, this is definitely becoming a global issue, mainly because of the emerging legislation. So, you know, many of you will be aware that most jurisdictions across the globe have equal pay legislation. But more recently, we're starting to see specific legislation coming in around gender pay. And then now, following up in the UK, we're expecting ethnicity pay gap reporting to become mandatory as well next year. But as a global employer, you have this challenge of lots of different legislation emerging. There's a whole load of it sort of focused here in Europe, where I sit, very much focusing around pay transparency on a compulsory basis, reporting requirements on a compulsory basis, and gender audits, as we've recently seen in Germany and France, which is looking at a more broader set of metrics rather than just looking at pay from a sort of public reporting perspective. And then I know obviously in the US there you have your EEO1 pay reporting coming up, you know, maybe starting to happen in September this year. So what happened was you had global companies who were maybe having to tackle reporting on pay gaps in a specific jurisdiction. And when they took those issues to their global executive boards, they were going, well, you know, we understand that you don't fix pay gaps by just fixing pay. What we actually need to do is address a broader set of diversity initiatives to try and fix this. And if we're going to do that, we don't want to just do that in one country. We want to address that on a global basis. And so we are starting to see companies who are addressing this topic on a global basis, so undertaking global pay audits. So primarily that's been for legislation, but also it's all about employee engagement and engaging employees around the whole topic of fairness and being seen to be a diverse employer. A recent study by the EHRC, the Equality Human Rights Commission here in the UK, last year showed that 2/3 of women actually look at the publicly published gender pay gap of a company before deciding to go to work for it. So that's, you know, that's quite a powerful sort of impact in terms of your future talent looking at your publicly reported gender pay gaps. And that kind of brand perception isn't just for your, you know, current and future employees, but also it's becoming recognized that diversity is important in terms of your customer orientation and also from a broader stakeholder perspective from your investors. So we've had the whole Arjuna Capital happening a lot in the US, you know, forcing organizations to look at this issue on a global basis. Then there's the whole McKinsey studies, which have looked at the correlation between a good record, a strong record on diversity and business performance, such that this is really becoming a C-suite issue. And many CEOs are recognizing that if they want to improve all these aspects of their organization and ultimately drive business performance, this is a compelling business issue that they need to address. And we have seen a whole number of larger companies starting to actually publicly share their experiences of undertaking a global pay equity study. And so that are just a few of the companies I've put there. I mean, what's interesting about these studies, I don't know if any of you have you know, looked into these, is that obviously there is no global legislation telling you that you have to pay your people in Hong Kong the same as your people in New York, and there is no global standard in terms of what you should do if you're going to do a global exercise on pay equity. And you're just looking at the logos on this slide, you know, Adobe's case study, for them, they said that they were going to address pay parity on a global basis, but that would mean looking at making sure that employees within country, within role, were paid equally. whereas Citigroup, they actually published in January this year their raw or unadjusted pay gap of 29% for women globally. So they were very much looking at this as a global pay gap perspective. And I'm going to come back to that, addressing pay equity and pay equality shortly. So we are seeing these companies starting to go down this process of addressing pay equity on a global basis. There's a number of steps that are involved. It's quite a complex exercise. And this is really where we're looking at bringing technology to the table in order to help enhance this process and make it a lot easier for organizations to undertake. And really, you know, to date, if you have done that type of exercise, you've normally done that with some external consulting resource. And what we're wanting to do with technology is, I guess, democratize the process, make it much more attainable for all organizations to address this compelling business issue, and give companies greater ownership of the process, so that they can do this on a sort of BAU process, because what's tended to happen to date is that many pay equity audit exercises have happened on a one and done basis, because it's been quite an expensive process and it's been quite a painful process, and we're trying to give companies the ability to be able to run this themselves on an ongoing basis, so it's not just something that you do once a year. And we'll show you the product, and we often, you know, we get asked quite often when we share the product with people, you know, what is it you're trying to address here? Are you trying to address pay equality, or are you trying to address pay equity? And in essence, we are trying to do both. The product that I'm going to share with you today is very much addressing the raw cohort gaps, so looking at pay equality. So you'll be able to see how you can upload data sets as an employer, and you can start to break down looking at pay gaps by different subsets of your global population. And then Gazelle will explain what we're going to do in terms of introducing our regression analysis, which will be allowing users to move from looking at their raw pay gaps to their adjusted pay gaps, which will be more specifically looking at pay equity at the job level, job family, or job and location basis. So Gazelle, at that point, I'm going to hand over to you to start the introduction on Pay Equity Tracker.
Yeah, absolutely. So we basically, through all of the research that we've done, we've decided that it's time for us to start to introduce a tool for companies to be able to do their own pay equity studies. So again, introducing Pay Equity Tracker. What you're seeing on the screen is basically just a little bit of an overview of what we have to offer in terms of dashboards and the ability to kind of get to some of the analytics behind the scenes as well. Now, the Pay Equity Tracker is intended to be a self-service and fully configurable product. The intent is, again, with all the different legislations that different companies are needing to answer to, whether it be globally or even just within the US with the differences between the states, to be able to focus in on the things that are important to you based on where you actually do business and what types of reporting and analysis you're required to do, as well as even getting into some of the details about what your company in particular does. I think the bottom line is in that last line talking about providing analysis that's needed to really think globally, but being able to still act locally and being able to also take action on individual employees and track that information as you go. Now, part of what we do is basically providing some powerful insight through some of the interactive dashboards that you'll be able to see within the demo. You can actually control the analysis of your data. So it's having all of this information at your hands, but then through some guidance in the tool, being able to drill down into the specific areas where you may need to focus, and then the system actually giving you a little bit of insight into the individuals that actually need some, whether it's justification or tracking certain actions that are being taken as well. And then finally, looking at highlighting where policies and practices and behaviors may be contributing to the ongoing inequity. So we know that it's above and beyond just looking at the raw data, but also being able to dive deeper and actually do some more in-depth analysis going into some of the regression analysis, and then calculating and modeling any kind of recommendations so that you know exactly what you have in front of you and be able to present to your company in terms of what kind of expenses is going to take to correct the actions as well.
Okay, so I think I'm just going to jump straight in now. I'm just going to change my screen view for you, and we'll jump into a demo of the tool. But yeah, Nov, should we just pause there before we do that to just ask any questions? If anybody's got any questions before we share the product with you.
That sounds an appropriate thing. Just open up to the group and see if there are any questions that are coming out. Anyone having to ask? I suspect the demo will generate it, but let me ask just a general perspective from my own curiosity. So, do most of your customers have Curo Compensation in place, and as they go to this pay equity situation, are they overriding, or if you will, replacing their compensation system existing? Let's say maybe a suite situation like I don't know, PeopleSoft or whatever, with your product, and if so, then you're having to build an interface in and out of your product and their HCM system. So that's number one question. And then secondly, from the standpoint, and maybe they will sit in the demonstration, but again, it strikes me, and again, not being an HR professional, my apologies for being just a techie, why would you not want to put this at the front door in recruiting and just from going forward, make sure you've got pay equity going forward everywhere you go? And to your point about this global versus locally, your ability to do that on a very localized basis on each office and so on. So two questions out there, if you don't mind, see if they, unless you address those as you go through the demo, we'll put them on hold.
Do you want to take those, Gazelle, and answer the first one? I think about integration.
Yeah, I'd say, which one would you like me to take? I apologize.
We'll go back to, let's go to are they replacing their compensation component in an HCM suite with the Curo Compensation module?
I would say yes, we are seeing a lot more of that. Part of what it really boils down to is in a lot of the HCM suites, the compensation systems are not robust enough to truly manage to some of the plan designs and the business rules that a lot of our customers would want to enable. So rather than just kind of dealing with just good enough, they want a solution that actually does manage to their actual compensation strategies. So from that perspective, I mean, we'll definitely have a mixture of customers that are needing to integrate, getting data directly from their HR system, potentially getting data from our system. It just kind of depends on where those systems of record are. And ultimately, when it comes to some of the ongoing pay history that we're looking at, we're still going to have to integrate with their core HR system either way.
Okay. And then, like I said, the second question, and like I said, it's more naivety on my perspective. It seems like a simple perspective. Connect, if you will, the pay equity tracking perspective into the recruitment process so that you literally are creating the pay equity as people are coming in the front door as candidates. So you're not having, in a sense, you prevent this and then you go back and try to cure the symptoms all the way around, but all the stuff coming in is at least back on track. Are you seeing clients doing that, or is that the usage of the product in a slightly different manner?
Yeah, I think that's sort of where what we're trying to do with this technology is move on from that sort of one and done approach where you go into a pay equity audit, you maybe affect some pay changes, remedial actions, you change people's pay, but you don't necessarily change any of the underlying policies and principles that actually created those pay gaps in the first place, or those pay differences in the first place. So part of what we will have in the product when we do our second release is root cause analysis, which will allow users to be able to look at the impact of things like tenure, performance, location, education level, age, and to be able to see, what impact that is having if you map that as a trend line for, on a gender basis or any protected category basis, in order to understand whether those issues may be causing, they may have underlying issues for you that you need to address.
Got it. Super, okay. Thank you. Anyone else have a question?
Hey, Nova, it's Rob.
Please, go ahead.
I'm real interested in kind of the change management and the acceptance, because I certainly understand. I'm a comp guy, I'm an analytics guy. I've been doing this kind of work in some form or another for quite some time, but I've always found that the biggest hurdle was less about the math and less about the analysis, and a lot more about the acceptance. I've worked with an awful lot of companies where the reaction, the general approach falls in the ignorance is bliss category. Don't ruin a good story with facts, and and here in the States it's even more of a challenge these days. But I'll even pick on my high tech colleagues in Google. You look at some of the stuff that they've done, where they've really severely fallen on their sword by publishing data, and really, to be very blunt, done very little about it. So that's the part of the challenge in the United States, and I'd be really interested in terms of how you've managed some of that transition and managed the, to be kind, the skeptical client, or the one who just doesn't want, we're doing fine, leave us alone, which is Google's attitude, I think. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I don't know. Sorry, Gazelle, I was wondering whether you were going to answer that one. Yeah, and actually, just to be clear here, this is a new product that we're launching. So we have had some early adopters, some of our existing client base playing with the version that I'm going to show with you today, but we won't. This product won't be available in the market until August, because we're at the moment, as you'll see in a minute when I'll jump into the demo in a second, we have the ability to do the raw pay gap analysis currently, but we are just currently building our regression model that will allow the users to do that step from raw to adjusted pay gap work.
So in a sense, Rob, I think you've perhaps identified one of the early perspectives and obstacles that the Curo Compensation group will encounter to a degree when you run into this and say, yeah, it's great, but I think we're okay. Maybe we'll have to have a report back later on, maybe later in the year.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, and give us another call in a year.
Exactly.
When they've implemented several hundreds who have finally adopted this program. So anyway,
that's where I'm looking forward to hearing about
how it's gone practically. Yeah.
Any other questions? If not, we'll certainly let Ruth and Gazelle get into the demonstration. Okay, well, let's go for it.
Great. Okay, so this is our sort of demonstration release, and as I think I just said, this is where we're going to start. This is a self-service tool, so the idea is that users will be able to manage the process themselves. They would probably have some professional support to help them get started on the product, and then we are working with various partners who may be helping them with the sort of the whole process that I think, Rob, that you just alluded to, that is wrapped around this. So we're focusing here on the technology, but this is a complex and multifaceted process. You've got to start at the beginning of this process before you even switch technology on, thinking about attorney-client privilege, and then really looking at all the legal consequences through this in all the jurisdictions within which you operate. But this is designed really as the technology enabler to help you manage the data. And so in that sense, it's designed that the user will be able to upload the data sets themselves. So they will conduct pay equity analysis on data sets. And they do that by creating a mapping template, which is what you can see on screen now. So I've got one set up, which is the sort of gives you a feeling of the basic data that you would need to undertake a pay audit. So you would basically set up this data mapping template. In this, you can include the protected categories that you wish to make pay comparisons on. So I have gender set up as one of my comparator groups, and you have the flexibility within this to be able to change the main comparator group. So normally, you know, comparisons are made by comparing female pay against male pay, but when you start looking at ethnicity or race, and you're looking at that on a global basis, it may be that you wish to change your main comparator group depending on which region, for example, you might be focusing that analysis on. So you have the flexibility to change the main comparator groups within this. So a user would set up their data template. They would be able to then define what protected categories they wish to do the analysis on. So are they wishing to look at gender and ethnicity once they've sort of uploaded that data? Do they want to compare also their full-time to part-time employees, which is also a common comparison? Then what types of compensation do you want to make comparisons on? So, you know, this is for them to make comparisons internally within the organization. So do they want to just make comparisons on basic pay and bonus pay, or bonus pay and total compensation? So they're able to define, you know, how they want to make those comparisons. Then they can define in the dashboards where they're going to see the resulting data. Do they want to look at this on a mean or median basis? So they can change the lens in terms of looking at the aggregate calculations. And then we also have a flagging system throughout the product, which will highlight at an employee level whether the pay equity position of the employee against your chosen comparator group or your chosen dimension comparison is acceptable, needing attention, or unacceptable. And the user, you know, is able to define when they're doing an analysis, you know, on this flagging system, what they want to define as acceptable. We are also multi-currency because we're enabling global comparisons. So you will, in your setup, define your main comparator currency, which we've got as US dollars, but then you can add currencies to each data set, and you can define the FX rate that you want to use in each data set to make those sort of global comparisons. So once you've gone through your settings process, you've set up your data template and you've uploaded your data, you will then have access to a published dashboard that will kind of take you through on an interactive basis your key headline figures. So again, just to reiterate, this is showing you your raw gender pay gap or your raw ethnicity pay gap data. So there's a headline dashboard that shows you the key metrics. So this is for a global population. And then we have a dynamic dashboard area, which is where you can start to drill down into potentially by country, but users can, you know, decide what they want to plot in these charts. So they can change between gender and ethnicity, and they could maybe look at this by job band on a global basis. And all of these charts will be exportable, and they can highlight just their full-time employees in the chart. So doing a comparison of full-time to non-full-time employees, and they have the option to be able to obviously change the visuals on these charts and export all of that information. And then they can also filter these charts as well. So they've got an interactive area where they can start to look on a more specific basis where pay gaps may be occurring. Then they have the option of starting to play around with that in one of the data dimension tables. So we immediately come into this table looking at the issue of pay gap on a country basis, because that's the role that many organizations are taking. But I can add to this comparison group if I want to take that down to a more specific level. Maybe I want to look at, if I'm looking on a US basis, I want to look at it within country and office. So I can add that dimension to the table. and it will immediately recalculate based on the dimensions that you've added to the table. And if I wanted to go one step further, it may be that what I want to do is I want to look at this very much on a pay equity basis and look at a specific role in a specific location and start to look at how people are paid against each other in a given role. And I think I saw a question pop up, I think, earlier about statistical significance and the size of groups. I think the question was something like, what happens if it's a 1,000 size company? So yes, that's an extremely valid question, and the user will have the ability to be able to set statistical limits if they wish to groups. So I think if I change this table around, some of these groups, currently I don't have any limits applied, have just got one employee in them, which obviously is going to be a relatively senseless calculation, but you would be able to define that as a user. Then what you have the ability to do from the dynamic calculations is to start to drill down into the individual employees that sit within these groups. So clicking on any of those groups, I then get to see the employees that sit within that group. So what we're trying to do here is, as you go through a pay audit, you can also start to manage the employees individually within that process. So you can start to look at each individual's record. You can drill down into an individual view card. Hopefully it will take me through to now. I clicked that, no I didn't click it, there we go. Right, we're going to go through to this Mark McDonald's individual view card. So here is all the employee data that we uploaded. In that data upload, all of that is editable, so you can go in and edit any of those data fields. It may be that you wish to change a value for the purpose of the pay audit exercise. You can see a summary of how that individual is comparing against the different category groups, and then you've got the ability to be able to mark that employee as someone that you have reviewed. You can also mark a justification. So it may be that the reason why this person is paid more or less is due to some location premium, and then you can also add action points. So please add to next review for action. So you can track actions against each employee, so they will stay there. And we're also going to give users the ability to be able to export those actions and apply dates to those actions. And you can see for each individual employee, for the different data sets, or each time you performed an audit, you can see how they sat, where their compensation was at, and any justifications that were loaded against individuals at that time. And then on the interactive dashboard, you've also got the ability to track those flagging system that I showed you earlier. So if I just, scroll down there. So this is tracking my population. So this demonstration population is 590 employees. I can see that I've reviewed just one of those employees. I've got an action item against one of those employees, and then I can see from the RAG status, from the red, amber, green status, how many employees are in each of those different categories. So it's just designed to be highly visual. All of that will be exportable, and users will be able to sort of play around with the data to understand where they have different pay gaps occurring within their organization. Now, from these dashboards, they can also filter on these dashboards. So if I didn't want to, for example, I decided I just wanted to look at the US, then I can select that and apply that, and the whole dashboard will then update with data just based on my US employees, and it will also highlight on the dashboard that we have got a filtered population there, so showing me that actually I've now filtered that population. There's just 26% of the overall population showing in that, but I can still go through that same experience then of seeing all those interactive dashboards, all the charts, but now just on a filtered basis.
Ruth, do you mind possibly taking a couple of questions?
Yeah,
I know I've been watching the chat box there, and there are probably a couple of things that would relate back to the demonstration itself on the screen that was up. So anyone have any questions they want to ask of the Curo Compensation team? I know I have a couple of very quick ones, but anyone else? Bobby.
Hi there.
Yes.
Yeah, hey,
Howdy.
hi, how are you? Yeah, I have a question. Like, why would somebody want to buy this? You know, I mean, it's wonderful in what it does. I mean, you certainly got the technology and the data analytics down. But if I'm a company, like, what's my incentive to spend the money on this? You know, am I going to get sued, or, you know, if I don't have this? You know, does it link to employee turnover? You know, and does the turnover cost the company money? I'm just curious.
Yep. Well, I think first of all, from a legislative perspective, you know, it's not designed to provide a solution to make sure you're compliant to any specific legislation. When we designed this initially, it was very much thinking about doing a global pay audit, although we have had a lot of interest from law firms in the US and from compensation consultants in the US who are potentially seeing this, once we build in the regression model, as something that would help to tackle some of the pay equity issues that you have there in the US. But we are seeing, you know, companies who do want to address these issues on a global basis in terms of, you know, thinking about pay gaps and pay equality. And as I said earlier, you know, we had global companies who did their gender pay gap reporting in the UK because they were required to do from a mandatory perspective, and they saw that they had pay gaps. And then when they started to understand the issues for their pay gaps, the only way you're going to fix those issues is by addressing things like recruitment, by addressing other leakages and blockages in your talent pipeline, such as looking at promotion committees, looking at how you can encourage women to come back from maternity leave, looking at issues of shared paternity leave. And those global companies decided that that wasn't something they wanted to just do in one location. It didn't make sense. Why would you just want to tackle those issues in one location? If you want to have a strong record on diversity as a global employer, this was something they wanted to address globally. And so that was why we had organisations saying, could we use your gender pay gap tool that you've developed for the UK? Can we just upload a global data set for that? We said, well, you can, but that's very specific to the UK legislation. So we said, what we'll do, we'll create a product that will allow you to do that on a global basis that's more flexible. So to your specific question there, Bobby, you know, it is about talent retention, and it is about maximizing your talent base and maybe some of the hidden talent that you have and the talent potential in your organizations, that if you are addressing the issues that drive pay gaps, then you are addressing the fact that you may have a more diverse workforce.
Yeah. Any other questions? I do have a couple of real quick ones, but anyone else have any questions for the Curo team? Okay, well, let me ask again. This is the techie in me. My apologies. So I'm looking at the dashboard as you're doing it, and I certainly see things expressed in either euros or pounds or whatever. So if I am the administrator of this system, am I going to have to do the translation of the currencies of the data sets coming in from maybe different systems to then bring them to the dashboard so they can be expressed in a set of currencies that are universal? In other words, maybe our CFO is in the US and we need to see it in US dollars. Or does Curo Compensation bring in that raw data and then make a translation at the time of reporting for whatever currency we're looking
so that's
for?
Second, so each employee you would load in their, so one of our mandatory fields is an employee's currency. So you would load the employee in their local currency, and then the FX rates that you've defined for that data set will be used to convert that data set. And then when you're working within the system, you can obviously change that view to any of the currencies, and that will be converting that, you know, at that rate table there that you've got for an FX rate. And actually, you know, looking at data set comparisons, because that's an interesting point, you know, we've got these highlights on the main dashboard here that's looking at the last data set. A feature that I can't show you right now that is being developed is a data set comparison feature that will allow you to select data sets and then decide which FX rates you want to compare those, because it may be that you compared a data set that you ran in January, for example, to another data set that you ran in June using different FX rates. And if you compared them, you may end up with a pay gap, but actually that's just reflective of changes in FX rates. So you can FX neutralize that and choose which data set's FX rate you want to use for comparative purposes.
Very nice. So on that same perspective, and this is just an observation, I probably should say this more for the feedback section, but I'm curious about, and I'm asking actually the Technology Review Council as well, what you're creating is another data set of information that if you look at the analytics, going back to Bobby's question, how do I relate what I'm seeing in the gender gap situation to possible things like the turnover or retention rates of certain populations based on the fact that although pay is an important part, it's not always the reason why people leave, but it's certainly sometimes a big reason. And more specifically, how do I show myself, let's say in 2019, in the year 2020, how have I done? Do I have the ability to establish a baseline in 2019 and then compare again in 2020?
Yep, so all of these dashboards you can save as snapshot reports. So you can create a basically from that data set, you can give it a name, you can define whether you want to fix that data set at a point in time. So at the time that you uploaded that data set, so you could create a filter on this report. If I only wanted this to be the US population, for example. Sorry, I can't spell.
That's okay. Spell check was corrected for you.
So I can define whether I want to snapshot the data that I've been looking at on the dashboard as it sits today when I did the analysis, or I can choose it to be a live report that I'm saving the template, but as new data is added and new employees are added, it will update that report as well. But you can go through the process of choosing which data set you want to snapshot. You can play around with the filters again. You can say, actually, I only want to look at the US and I want to look at gender and I want to look at basic and bonus pay. And then you can, again, adjust the RAG flags if you wish, and then you can save that as a snapshot. And all those snapshot reports will sit on your reporting dashboard here. So that's how you'll be able to have your baseline and go back to it to be able to compare over time.
Yeah, we always try to figure out how well did we do. We found the problem. We think we have a cure. Now, how well did we execute on that one? So this is excellent. Any other questions? If not, let me allow you to go back to the. Oh, I'm sorry. So there was one. I'm sorry.
This is Rob again. Sorry. Again, I find it really interesting. I'm very interested to see, and just to give you a little bit of background, I was an HR business partner for a global sales organization in 60 countries, and we were constantly dealing with pay equity issues. And one of the worst pay equity issues was in the UK compared to our salespeople in the US, and we had all sorts of gyrations that we had to do. How do you take into account, all of the what I guess I characterize as ancillary issues like benefits and local pay equity compared to peers versus global pay equity compared to peers in the company. A sales manager in the UK with $10 million in quota compared to a sales manager in, Mexico with $5 million in quota. And we had all sorts of issues. And then on top of it, we had issues with stock equity, because we use stock as a retention tool heavily and to basically deal with some of the my wallet's bigger than your wallet exercises. So again, at a very high level, it's really interesting as it gets really tactical, and I'm remembering many of the comparisons that I used to have to do with executive management, and it was a challenging conversation, to say the least.
Yeah.
And the good news is we had them engaged, because it was salespeople, and you know, it's all about the dollar at the end, or euro or whatever at the end of the day, as opposed to the diverse, what I was referring to earlier with our friends at Google and stuff like that, where it's kind of like, leave me alone, don't call me for a year. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, absolutely. And I think, this is, again, this type of exercise on an international, on a global basis is new for organizations. So
Yep.
A lot of this is kind of going to be them defining the basis on which they want to make comparisons. So do I want to look at pay gaps on a global basis? Does that make
Right.
sense for me and my organization? Or, going down the Adobe route, actually, for me, pay parity means that if I'm paying all my employees in a country, in a location, in a job equitably, then I'll define that that's pay parity. And yes, you will have obviously pay gaps if you start comparing people in different levels of economic market between the Philippines and between the US. Those comparisons are very difficult to make. So on the types of compensation, as I said, the way that we've defined this is just we give the users 3 buckets against which they can upload data. They can choose. We don't define it. They can choose what they want to bring together in order to make those comparisons. So, it can be just base pay, it can be bonus pay. It may be that in the base pay, they want to include all any fixed allowances. So that would include any in-country allowances, so that you're making comparisons on that basis. That's kind of really for the user to define.
Yeah. So I show about 10 minutes left, and I wasn't sure, Ruth, if you were done with the demo. So let me let you go back to that.
Yep. I'm just going to ask Gazelle, do we have a slide that explains more about the regression analysis functionality that you were going to talk to?
I don't know that we actually have a slide to talk to it specifically, but we can certainly address it. Absolutely. I don't think that was included in the deck.
Yeah. So what I've shown you so far is focused on the raw pay gap analysis and pay. Probably what we need to do is come back again and show you the regression analysis when it's built. But what we are bringing in is a multivariate regression model that will allow you as the user to be able to define what controls you want to apply to your raw pay gaps. So do you wish to apply tenure? Do you wish to apply performance, location, to try and analyze and explain your pay gaps? And so they'll be able to go through the process of running models to test for explained pay gaps. And the outcome of that is to see on an individual basis the difference of an employee's pay against a predicted trend pay, and then that's when they may be, you may start to look at individual pay equity adjustments as well. So that's a sort of the next step that we are developing currently, and will be available towards the end of July or through into August.
Very nice. So folks, we're kind of near the wrap-up spot. Again, if you have additional questions you'd like to ask, this is the time to do so. I would also say in the course of this, please provide some feedback. These folks have been working real hard in the development of this product, and we saw them last year, and this was not even on the drawing board per se that I remember, but it certainly, like I say, a lot of progress has been made since. And I, what you've shown out to us, Ruth, as your roadmap is certainly going to, I think, lead the trend from what I'm seeing. Being aware of so many different other vendors of what their focus is, this is not one of them. You may be owning this market real quickly. But as I was saying, the analytical data that you're now putting together into your dashboards seems like it has a great deal of relationship with the other thinking about. So what am I looking at when I'm thinking about retention? What are the factors in my culture, the way in which I can compensate people, and so on? All these things we're trying to analyze to really understand, are we doing a good job or a bad job? So folks, here's your chance to ask and provide some feedback, and then we'll go from there. So let me open up the floor for anybody who wishes to say anything. And there are a couple of folks in that crowd I know are willing to say something, so please don't hesitate. Any perspective, any feedback for the group?
Hi, this is Sherry Meyer. I really like this. I could see that a company could design something like this themselves with their own data, but this seems simple to use. And I think the problem that HR struggles with is they don't know how to use their data to create a nice picture like this. And the way you walked through it with us, it seemed very easy, just point and click almost, to create this nice dashboard that we see in front of us and be able to quickly highlight these gaps in pay. So thumbs up from me.
Thank you.
Very nice. Thanks, Sharon. Anyone else? I'm curious. I know the number of folks in the Technology Review Council are global organizations. And as such are probably exposed to this in some capacity if you're in some of the European nations and such. So what is your perspective of what you're seeing in there? Are there any perspectives that you could share that says, yeah, oh, we are doing this and there's why we aren't doing it with Curo right this moment? I'm just curious about the general sense of that. Please go ahead.
This is Rob again.
Sure.
Sorry, I'm one of those outspoken ones.
That's okay. I gave them a warning about you, Rob. I'm just kidding.
Bless your heart. To me, the biggest, I love the setup. I love the presentation. I'll have to tell you, my biggest concern, especially for a global organization, is the devil's in the detail. Comparing the Philippines to the U.S. just doesn't, how do I do that? I don't. But and the other struggle I have, and it's across HR technology and especially in the analytics space, is upgrading HR's capability to understand the data. It's like how do I can put this in front of a bunch of HR professionals and get them all excited about it, but then the fear factor kicks in where it's, oh my God, I've got to explain this to my leadership who knows more about data than I do, and there's that combined with a real to the question, to one of the other questions that was asked around real concern about, well, why do I want to do this? And I was lucky. I had salespeople on a global basis who understood why they cared about this in 5 seconds, so that was not a hard sell. But the HR community, who's terrified of this, at least in many cases, this is kind of scary, especially when you throw in the diversity component in a pretty challenging diversity environment right now in the U.S. It's you have no idea which way you're going to go. And again, to go back to my case, I had a sales organization with a leader who's like, my organization needs to reflect the diversity of my clients. Period. No discussion. End of discussion. And that's
enlightened.
Very, very powerful leadership. But I haven't seen any company come out that strongly in 10 years.
Well, I mean, I think, this is definitely, as I said at the beginning when I referenced the IBM survey, this is not something that all companies are doing. It is something that is emerging as practice, where companies are wanting to think about how they address this issue, not just on a local basis. Yeah. And once you layer on race, nationality / ethnicity, whatever you want to call it, then it becomes an even more complex picture to make comparisons globally. But
you mentioned Adobe. Are you working with Adobe?
No, we're not. No, but they're one of the sort of quite well documented case studies globally in terms of how they went down this route. And I think someone mentioned it, also the companies like Nestle, they're one of the companies that have built their own model to do this in-house. So they have a bunch of data scientists that built their own model in-house, and they've shared that with some other companies. So there are companies out there who are wanting to start to look at this issue. And I guess what Curo has always been about is, I strongly believe, but particularly when it comes to pay equity, that just because you're a big company and you can afford to pay for expensive consultants or lawyers to help you do this process, every company should have the opportunity to be able to address this issue. And so for me, it's about using technology to democratize the process.
Got it. Good. Thanks.
Other questions? I'm always good for one myself, but I want to give the crowd the opportunity. So, in the absence of that, let me ask.
This is.
Oh,
no,
sure, please go ahead.
No, this is. Sorry. I guess the only thing that in my view, what we're challenged with, I'm part of a global organization that's all over the world, and so what we're challenged with is basically the in-house expertise and the resources that would actually utilize the system. I mean, I think in general, the tool is incredible, but we tend to rely on outside sources to do our storytelling and to help us. And so it kind of, I would love to have something like this house, but it also requires us to upscale resources within our own business.
This is why Eric and I are such good friends, because he just led in great segue into my next question of the Curo Compensation team, and that is, do you provide consulting services not around just the product and the implementation, but if you will, the understanding of what I'm seeing in my data?
Yeah, so the answer is we provide professional services support in terms of physically using the product, but we don't provide the consulting support, and that's why we work in partnership with other organizations that would use our tool. So we have already successfully white labeled our gender pay gap product, the UK product, with a law firm and with some other partners who they use this product as part of their overall service offering. So that is a similar operating model that we would see with this product. And I think Rogerio is on the call, but we've had a lot of interest from partner organizations in the US and in Europe who are interested in having the ability to have this technology as part of their overall offering, because this is the bit that takes a lot of time but doesn't necessarily generate as many fees, where it's the more consultative support where they generate more fees.
Excellent. So I will ask the Technology Review Council group that if you are working with some exceedingly good compensation analysts and storytellers, if you will, and all the other stuff, please let me know. Rogerio is the right place for us to connect people so they can take a look at the product and maybe join that partnership program. So feel free to contact me or any other Curo Compensation group. The other question I have is, and this is more of a perspective of the validation of what you do in your reports dashboard. Legislatively, are there any, I want to say, arms of any government that are looking at this as a way of helping you to validate that everything you're doing is right on line for what it is they are looking for when companies are reporting pay equity?
So this, no, the product is not built to be specific to any jurisdiction or legislation.
Right,
it is
okay.
more designed for global exercises. Although that said, from the US interest perspective, we are looking at whether we can produce the EEO1 reports, the pay reports through the product, so giving people the opportunity to upload that data and automatically create those reports. So that's something that we've been asked to consider by some of the US partners.
And I say that in conjunction with this last question on my behalf, and again, my apologies for kind of hogging the conversation, but so like any good cloud company, any SaaS organization, you are sitting on a wealth of information. Do you believe as time goes on that you would be able to help to establish some sense of benchmarks and so on from the data that you're gathering?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Yeah, yeah, it's definitely something that we would think about in time. You know, in the UK scenario, because the data is publicly reported, as an organisation, you can compare your numbers to any you know, chosen company. But that is something, you know, in time, as more companies do this, that, you know, potentially that is something that we would want to offer through this product too.
Outstanding. So one last call to the group out there. Any other last questions, feedback, or anything that you'd like to provide? If not, I will say thank you very much to the Curo Compensation team. Outstanding presentation. I think we would love to invite you back when you have, shall we say, more of the product in place, and certainly a couple of clients under your belt, and maybe even bring them along with you. Love to hear from them. And thank you to the Technology Review Council as well. Again, I appreciate you joining us and listening in and contributing as we go through. This has been valuable for us as a group, and valuable to the vendors. So we'll keep on doing what we're doing. Again, thank you, everyone. For those of you in the U.S., happy 4th of July upcoming. For the rest of us, it's just another day in the week.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Stay well.
Thank
Take care.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.